This is part 8 of the Craftsman King Seeley 3-wheel bandsaw rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 7, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we will complete the assembly of the bandsaw as well as install the motor and the Slo-Speed converter. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Continuing with assembly, we will be installing the upper idler wheel shaft and square head set screw. And I end up having to remove this later on because I should have installed the upper blade guard first, but no big deal. So we're just installing that first snap ring that holds the idler wheel properly spaced on the shaft. And we're going to go ahead and put the inner snap ring for the drive shaft on the drive shaft. Next, we're going to install the drive shaft wheel. So this wheel does not have the needle bearings, and there is a slot in it, a key slot for the Woodruff key that's on that drive shaft. And it's kind of a tight fit, so we just need to pop it in there. I'll end up using a socket to seat it. And once it's seated, we can install that last snap ring that holds it on the shaft. Next, we've got the washer that goes on the idler wheel shaft and then the idler wheels. But since they're going to spin against that washer, I'm going to go ahead and apply some super lube to the boss on both sides of the bore. Once it's on there, then we can put the second washer on there, and then the snap ring. Next, we're going to apply some machine oil into that oil port that's on the wheel to lubricate those bearings, needle bearings that are inside there. And then put the plug back inside that port and give it a couple spins. And we're good to go. So next we have the last idler wheel. Again, we're going to lube up the boss on both sides of the idler wheel. And put the washer on the shaft. And then the wheel. We had already put that first snap ring on there in the other video. And then the second washer. And then the last snap ring. And then we'll apply some machine oil just like we did for the top idler wheel. And then put the plug back in there. And give it a couple spins. And we're good to go. And it was at this point that I realized that I needed to install the upper blade guide, so I have to remove that upper idler wheel. So we'll remove the snap ring, the outer washer, and the wheel, and then we can install the upper blade guide. It has a long screw that protrudes through the back cover, and a knob goes on it to lock it in place, and then a second screw, that's a bottom screw, that has a spring on it, and it just tensions it so it holds it in place when you move it up and down. And then we'll put the top idler wheel back on. Now we're going to install the back cover. So that rear screw that adjusts the tension has to protrude through the back, or the left side as you're looking at it. And then there are 3 screws that protrude through the backside casing, and they get these cap nuts that go on them. And then there's a spacer, and then the knob. And this allows you to loosen and tighten to raise and lower the upper blade guide. Now, this knob has a long screw on it, and this is to adjust the tracking. This screw actually pushes on that paddle part on the tension and tracking assembly that I was telling you to remember about. And there's a indicator for the tension that gets slid onto the tensioning screw. And then we have the spring and a washer, and then a small spacer, and then the knob. There's the spacer and there's the knob. And until that spring really engages, this is all kind of wonky. But once that spring starts to compress, everything kind of lines up. And the indicator, you're supposed to adjust the tension of the blade with the marks on that indicator depending on the size of the blade. So these are drive screws. They're 1/4 inch, size number 4. And I'm just installing the data plate on the stator for the motor. With those drive screws. Next, we'll install the base for the motor. And then we have the terminal end frame. We're just going to use the mallet side of my brass hammer to knock it onto the stator. And then we've got the rotor. And it's a tight fit on those sleeve bearings that are in each end frame, but dead blow hammer, and we got it seated. It turns just fine. And then we've got the other end frame. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I'm actually installing it upside down right now. I'll have to turn it around when I realize it a little bit further into the video. And then we've got the long screws. There's 4 of them. And this will close up the motor. Now, these are the Oil Wicks, and I'm just going to put some 5W30 oil in there and let them soak. In the meantime, we're going to assemble the terminal brushes for the motor. Very simple design, very few moving parts. Gotta say, I really like this motor. Once those brushes are good, we're ready to wire it all up. Obviously, this motor being as old as it is, there was no grounding on the motor. So we're going to ground it to one of the long screws. And that's a dog loop that acts as a wire stress relief. Since this was not a grounded motor back then, I'm having to do a little cutout so that the grounding wire can come out of that housing. Then we'll tighten down the wiring and then screw the terminal onto the end of the motor. And we're ready to insert those oil wicks. So I don't want them just dripping oil, so we'll use a paper towel and just get a little bit of that oil on the outside of the wick off. They've been soaking for about 20 minutes. And this is where I realized that the other end is upside down. The wicks need to be on top, not on bottom. So we're just going to rotate that bell or that end frame and then reassemble the motor. So I picked up some rubber plugs and I'm going to cut them in half so they're not as long as they are, and insert them in each one of the openings for the wicks. Since I only have one of those original wick caps, I've actually got some different plugs on order, but they haven't arrived yet, so these will work. So we need to pull out that second wick. Dry it off a little. And then install it. And then we can put those plugs in. And they sit pretty much flush, so good to go. And then we'll just test run the motor. Purrs like a champ. And it's not overheating, smoking, or electrifying me, so we're good to go. Just letting it continue to run for a few minutes, few seconds. And then make sure it powers down properly. So next thing, we're ready to install that blade. So we're going to pull out that screw that holds the split in the table. True. And install the insert in the table. It's an aluminum insert that I ordered off of eBay. And then this is a 3/8 wide 62-inch metal cutting blade. I think it's a 14 tooth per inch. But we'll get it on the drive wheel first, and then the middle wheel, and then for the top idler wheel, this is where we have to play with the tension adjustment. So if we back off the knob and let the tension off of the spring, that assembly will slide, and we can compress it towards the center of the bandsaw enough that we can get the blade onto that wheel. Like so. And once we can get that blade to catch just on the uppermost part of that wheel, then we can spin that wheel a little bit and get the blade to walk on the rest of the way. And now that we're on the wheels, this is where we're going to have to do a lot of adjusting. So if you recall, the upper idler wheel and the two blade guides are locked in place with set screws. So they can be adjusted towards the camera or away from the camera to center themselves on the blade. I'm playing with the thrust bearing on the top one, and then I'm going to actually move the entire assembly on the bottom one back a little bit. I want about a 1/16 of an inch on the back side of the blade, between the blade and those thrust bearings, and then about a 32nd of an inch between the cool blocks and the blade. And I want those cool blocks to be riding almost dead center of the blade. And of course, I want the blade to be about dead center on the wheels. So once I think I've got everything pretty much lined up, we'll go ahead and start turning this by hand to see if the blade is going to track where we want it to track. I haven't adjusted the cool blocks yet, just the thrust bearings and the blade guards themselves. So here we go, and everything seems to be tracking really good now. But you can see how that upper thrust bearing is spinning and that's because the blade is riding on it right now. So we need to adjust that a little bit more so that there's a small gap between the blade and the thrust bearing. And then we can adjust the cool blocks. So we just undo the set screws that hold them in place, push them towards the blade, and then make sure that they're gapped properly. Next, we can install the actual blade guard, and this is a piece of aluminum that was machine turned, so it's got that engine turned pattern on it that looks really cool. Then we can tension the blade properly. So I'm going to turn it to where it says it's supposed to be on the scale, and then I'm going to thumb the blade and listen to it and see if it sounds correct. And once all that's done, we can go ahead and install the front cover. And we just need to line up those 3 mounting holes. And make sure that the blade guide slides up and down without rubbing on anything. Then we can go ahead and lock the cover in place with those 3 knobs. All right, so next I'm going to go ahead and apply a little bit of Johnson's paste wax to the table. Any paste wax will do, but I like the Johnson's. They don't make it anymore, and this is my last can, so we'll see how long that lasts. Then we're going to install that set screw that keeps the table true. Okay, so I had to remake the torsion bars for the slow-speed converter, but no big deal. I also had to get a bushing because the bore on the slow-speed converter is 5/8 and the shaft on the motor is a 1/2 inch. But once I got all that worked out, I fabricated these 2 torsion bars and painted them a close match for that gray, but you know, getting it exact is almost impossible. And this is just a classic machine gray from Krylon that I painted those 2 torsion bars with. So, of course, I forgot to go ahead and install the belt while I was doing this, so we're going to have to come back and reinstall the slow-speed converter. But once these 2 torsion bars are locked in place, you can't get a belt in there, so not a big deal. So here we're just going to do a little test run, make sure that everything runs as it should. And yes, it works like a champ. And it's actually not very loud at all. So we've got the belt. This is a 45-inch, 1/2 inch cogged V-belt. I like the cogged V-belts. I use those Duralast on this as well as the drill presses. Next, I've got a 6-inch pulley that I'm installing on the shaft, the drive shaft. And then we can install the motor and slow-speed converter, which is kind of a pain in the butt. It weighs a good amount. And if I did all my calculations correct, my surface feet per minute should be about 113, which is right in that sweet spot for cutting most metals, non-ferrous metals. But it should be able to cut 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch steel pretty decently as well. So we lock it in place, and then we can go ahead and plug the motor into the power panel. Then we can plug the extension cord into the power panel. And then test it. Right now, the blade is moving at the full speed because it's on the outer pulley. So if we loosen the motor mount, raise it up a little bit, move the belt to the inner pulley, and then retension it and retighten it down, then we should be moving at the 113. So this is just a piece of 1/8 inch steel angled, and we're just going to test, see how well it cuts. And it seems to be doing just fine. So that's that. And here it is sitting next to my 12-inch bandsaw 2-wheel. So that's both of the pedestal mounted bandsaws out of all the pedestal mounted tools. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. It's a good bandsaw. I like it. And my next series of videos will be about this. This is a Craftsman Emerson Gen 4 commercial drill press, model number 113.24520. And this one has some unique accessories. It has the pressmate table lift system, as well as that tilting table on the back side. So I will be doing some short videos on those accessories, but this will be the next series of videos. And these commercial drill presses are much more robust than the standard Gen 4 drill press. They have these 3 adjustment screws that allow you to adjust the take-up on the quill, as well as an eccentric take-up for the backlash on the feed. So this is my commercial Gen 4, and there was 2 different changes between the Gen 4 series. Notice mine only has an on-off switch, and this one has a separate switch for the light. A couple of other minor differences, but basically the same drill press. Anyways, that's what's coming up, and I hope you enjoyed this series. I hope you learned something. If you did, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate all the support, and I will see you next time.